So hello everyone and welcome to this conversation between Patrick Lejtenyi, advisor in public affairs here at Concordia, and Carmela Cucuzzella, professor in the design and computation arts department. We are streaming on YouTube live from Concordia University's Fourth Space, which is located on unceded indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And since at Fourth Space we endeavor to bring people together around the projects and development across the university, it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to invite Patrick in as he interviews Carmela about a recent publication on transit-oriented development. I'll pass it over to you both now to get started. Welcome.
Hello, Carmela. Nice to have you here at Fourth Space. So as Anna said, that we're here to talk about your new paper published in the journal Cities. It's a transit-oriented index that highlights the development potential around transit nodes. So before we get into the paper, why don't you give us a little bit of background into how you approach this and where you're coming from.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here and sharing my work with you. So just to give a preface of how this paper came to be is I have a funded project where I have been studying for the past 4 years. And the research is called Collaboratoire for Activating Multimodal Mobility. And so the premise at the beginning of that research project was really to try to understand how design of different urban elements can encourage people to use more public transport and therefore shift away from cars. As we started to develop that work, we realized that we needed to map the city of Montreal, for example, and try to understand the relationship between morphology and all of the other layers that make up the city. For example, all of the commercial layers, the residential layers and how close they are to transit, and et cetera, et cetera. So all the layers all together. And as we were qualitatively analyzing all of this work, we realized that, hey, why don't we stop and make an index that tries to understand how we can better develop the city for Todd, but by really working with the city and the investors in the city that try to develop the city. And so that's how this paper came to be.
Okay, now you add to the sort of existing literature. Can you tell us what you found that was missing with what you saw in previous Todd literature?
Yes. So one of the major areas that was missing was development potential. There are, indices in Todd have been ongoing for many decades, in fact, and they started off with this notion called node place model, which really means trying to understand around the transit node whether it's walkable, whether there's a diversity of commercial things, and if there is kind of a compelling path to get to the transit nodes. That became eventually larger to include kind of travel behavior, and so there was other indices that were being added to this kind of Todd indices that were being developed. What was not being developed, or very, very surface level was being developed, was the idea of development potential. And what does that mean? Well, development potential is kind of, the way we've defined it in the paper, is kind of a combination of three main things. So first is, what is the availability of developable land? So what is there that we can build on? Two is, what is the current density allowance? Okay, and what does density allowance mean? Is the city, in all of the city, has zoning, and zoning kind of stipulates how many floors we're allowed to build, especially when it comes to residential. That is density allowance, and that allows us and that limits what investors can build on certain sites. And so we combined the developable land with the density allowance, but then what we also did is we added something else called maximum density allowance. And what that is every single city around the world has a maximum density allowance that they would ever agree to. Mm-hmm. So that would normally be representative of their cores. So in Montreal, it happens to be around 150 units per hectare. And so what we did was we used that as the potential of developability around these major nodes that we were assessing. And so that's how we added the development potential. Okay.
So in your paper, you have there's three layers that are looked at. There's the socioeconomic characteristics, the economic vibrancy, and the development potential. How do you quantify those layers in the paper?
Okay. Well, I'm not going to go through all the equations because we have like over 11, like around 11 equations in the paper. So, but I will give you the premise of each of these layers because each of these layers have sub-themes in them. So if we look at the first layer, which is called the socio-environmental characteristics, we calculate the effectiveness of the walkable radius. What does that mean? If we say that there's a walkable radius around a transit station of 1 kilometer, what is hindering people to walk in that area? Is there like a river? Is there a mountain? Mm-hmm. Is there a railway? Is there an auto route? So in other words, is it really walkable? Okay, mm-hmm. So that's the effectiveness of walkability. Then the average green view index. So how comfortable is it to walk to the station? Is there canopy? Is there green spaces? So the pleasurability through the greenery. Mm-hmm. And the third one is the car use ratio because that actually helps us assess the potential of shift. Mm-hmm. So we want to understand how many people are in this area using their cars, and we have all that data because it's all accessibly open data. The second layer is called economic vibrancy, and this is where we collect Yelp data, but also commercial land data. So, there is lots of commercial land indices, and what that means is we calculate how much land in that walkable area, which is the 1 kilometer walkable radius, is dedicated to commercial amenities, because that also adds to the pleasurability and desirability of walking to a metro or a bus or a station or even a REM station. And the third layer is what I just described to you before, which is the development potential. And it's the combination of available land, the potential of the current density allowance. So if we develop the land to its current zoning, mm-hmm. And then the last factor in that third layer is if we develop within that 1 kilometer radius to the maximum density that the city allows. And how this is calculated is we collect all this data for all these three. We have to normalize it because they have to, anyways, we have to make sure that 3 layers are comparable and addable. And then what we do is we add all the indexes. And so what the index tells us is the higher the number, the higher the potential to be able to develop on that land and have a really important TOD node, mm-hmm. Okay?
And the purpose of this is to develop what you call a multinodal city, right? It's to spur economic development outside the downtown core.
Well, yes, the idea is and you know, we've realized that because this paper, the actual writing of this paper started pre-COVID, and now we're realizing, you know, almost post-COVID, that it's so important and so timely now because, you know, there's a large portion of the population that works hybrid. So in other mm-hmm. words, part of the week at home and part of the week at work, and therefore they do want vibrancy in their vicinity. And so the idea of developing kind of these polycentric areas around these major nodes is super important because it actually develops the behavior of people to walk around in their walkable 1 radius kilometer to their node. And therefore, the more they walk in that vibrant area, which is vibrant based on green, you know, walkable score, Yelp data, and commercial amenities, and even services, cultural services too. What that means is that they're more than likely than to just hop on the metro or hop mm-hmm. on the REM or hop on the bus because it's part of their daily behavior. So it seems very, very timely now that these polycentric cities make for a very vibrant. We're not saying that downtown core is going to be eliminated at mm-hmm. all, because the downtown core always remains the core. In fact, in this index, what we did was we calculated the potential development based on the vibrancy of the core of the city. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right. And now we are in Montreal. We're in downtown Montreal, and you use all this data and you apply it to the Montreal context. So how did you apply it to the REM? Which stations did you find that developers and planners should really be looking at to develop this multinodal city?
Yeah, and that's a great question because in fact, since we've published, since we've put it on LinkedIn, that's the question that we're always getting. So where should we be developing? Mm-hmm. And that's a great question. Well. So the main places to be developing are, for example, because don't forget, what we studied is the REM stations only. So of course we can expand this analysis to all of the metros and even basically the more than 8,000 bus stops. But because it's a paper of a limited length, so we only did the REM stations. So the three REM stations that came out on top were Fairview Pointe Claire, De Source, and Bois-Franc. And Bois-Franc a little less, and I'll explain to you why. So De Source and Fairview, the reason why they came up on top is because they have a high potential of development, because they're very low density right now. And around the REM station that's going to be built there, and that's going to be finalized there, if we try to imagine that just around the REM station we can develop it at the maximum density allowance that the city allows, which is not that big, which is, and I'll just give you an example, just to imagine what the maximum density allowance that the city allows, which is about 150 units per hectare, which is about a 6 to 8 story building on a 10,000 square meter lot. It's not that big. So it's very, very acceptable. We're not asking, 50-story buildings around the REM stations. We're asking for a very reasonable mid-density development. And so and the reason why De Source and Fairview came up on top is because they're actually very, very low density around that area. The other one is Bois-Franc, and it came up a little less. And the reason why it came up a little less, because it's already actively being developed as a very, very dense area. And it's actually quite beautifully being developed at the moment. And the ones that came out on the bottom are all of those sites that have high industrial areas, or for example, the airport site. So those clearly came out in the red. You don't even look at those because to change an industrial site into a residential site, that can take decades. So don't even look at that. So we were actually really looking at sites that have residential density parcels around the REM stations, and that's an important point too. There were many filters that we had to use in order to make these calculations, and one of them was that we only chose land parcels or sites of land around the 1 kilometer radius that were dedicated to residential development. We eliminated anything that was not residential development because, like I said, and everybody knows this by now, to change a density zoning is from one land use to another land use entirely is very, very difficult.
Yeah, years-long process.
Yes, exactly. So we didn't even touch that, okay?
Okay. Great, and then, so one of the, I think one of the beauties of this paper is that it's very transferable to other cities, right? Can you explain a little bit about how this can be applied to Toronto or Calgary or?
Yes, well, in fact, it could be applied to any other city that has open city data, because we relied on many sources of data. I mean, I'm not going to list them now, but I can just give you a few examples. So, for example, Montreal already has open city data. We use the Canadian census data. We used the Greenview Index that MIT has developed for all the major cities around the world. There was Yelp data. There was commercial index data. So and all of this data is publicly available to, first of all the major cities across Canada. So for example, Toronto will also have its own open data, and it obviously has the census data that we had access to, and all the other data that we had. So especially in Canada, this is completely transferable. When you get to other cities around the world, some of the data may be of different type, but every single major city around the world has all of the data accessible to them. So, and in fact, not only is it transferable to any city around the world, it's also transferable to any type of public transport mode. Because, like I said before, we only calculated REM. We could replace the REM stations with metro stations and make that calculation again and see which are the metro stations which would be the most potential for this development. We could also analyze the more than 8,000 bus stops around the city and to understand that. And so there's so much potential in this index to work together. And to me, the biggest, how should I say, the biggest kind of positive development of this, excuse the pun, of this, of this index is that it brings together the city planners and the investors of the city at the same table, because they can work together now, understanding the potential of the city. Because before, I mean, and we don't want to say it, but we often see that the city is often not at war with the investors, but really there's always tension with the investors. And this kind of index brings them together and helps them, you know, co-develop and develop the city together, so that it's good for the city, but it's also good for the investors. Because we cannot, you know, because at the moment, the model that we have is that the investors are the ones that are developing the major residential in the city. And until that model changes, this kind of index, and it may, because, you know, we are seeing diversity of development models, but until that model changes, this is the best way to do it forward. And even if the model changes, by the way, then the city planners still have this great tool to understand where to build around which stations, which metros, and which bus stops.
All right, Carmela Cucuzzella is a Concordia University Research Chair in Integrated Design and Sustainability for the Built Environment and founding co-director of the Next Gen Cities Institute. Thanks very much for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both so much as well for taking the time to come into ForSpace to have this conversation. We appreciate having you here live and in person, and we look forward to the upcoming media release about it. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Carmela. Until next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.